Hello, I'm Claire Snowden, darling,
I'm Laura Knowles.
and we are going to talk to you about food intolerances today. And let's just start off by discussing the difference between a food intolerance and an allergy because they get often misconstrued and confused. So, a food intolerance, we can have stacks of food intolerances. Uh, and a food intolerance is when you experience low level symptoms, in inverted commas, but some of those low level symptoms can be pretty life affecting. Uh, 20 minutes to 4 hours after eating. An allergy is a full blown immune response almost immediately. So in some cases, immediately, and definitely within 20 minutes. So that would be the case of someone with, a peanut allergy having an anaphylactic reaction as soon as that peanut is in the mouth, or in some cases they just need to touch a surface or breathe it in. That is an allergic reaction. That's a full-blown immune response. An intolerance is a much lower level response, 20 minutes to 4 hours after eating. But it's still an immune response, isn't it? It's still an immune response. So we want to talk to you about intolerances because we bang on about wheat, but it's not the only one we're interested in, is it?
It's not. I wanted to talk about the symptoms of food intolerances.
Yes.
Because there's the obvious ones: gut ache, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea. Digestion definitely takes a hit, but also because of the immune system response to food intolerances, we see a lot of skin issues,
Headache,
inflammation, joint pain, spots,
sinus issues, so a bit of extra mucus, post-nasal drip, constant things like ear infections,
hay fever,
weight issue in children, asthma, eczema, not growing, children who aren't growing, who are very stunted growth, very, very tiny, very often food intolerance.
mood swings,
Definitely.
especially in children.
Yeah. But definitely headaches and migraines. I was on migraine medication until I discovered I had a really big food intolerance.
I had a client who came in with headaches, and it turned out to be bananas.
Yeah.
Just cut bananas out, and then the headaches went away. So headaches are a big one.
Yeah. I was on prescription medication for years for migraines, which were, they were life affecting. Days and days just in dark rooms. And it was tomatoes. And I also lost a stone when I gave up eating tomatoes.
It's amazing, isn't it? Sometimes you can get those one-hit wonders. But what we wanted to talk about was our approach to food sensitivity.
Yes.
Because there are lots of different ways.
It's the same language, isn't it? Food sensitivity, food intolerance, same thing, not allergies.
So there are a number of different tests out there to identify food intolerance, and we do get quite a few questions about the blood test and the hair test, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Now, there's a few things here. The first is, one of the reasons I'm not a fan of hair testing is your immune system isn't static. Your immune system changes. So a hair test is only a snapshot of now, and therefore it's not really de facto as a response. It might be a de facto response now, but when you make changes, you're going to have that hair test done again, and they can be pretty costly. The other thing is, I don't find them particularly functional. So if you are experiencing, let's say, asthma, and you had a food intolerance test and it came back with 60 foods that you were intolerant to, a couple of things happen. First, massive overwhelm and I don't know what to eat. Second, we start going around with this big list of foods that we can't eat and some level of fear around that. And third, doesn't take into consideration really, well, that's not true. What I was about to say, it doesn't take into consideration how badly we're intolerant to them. But I know that you do get a grading system, like red would be a definite avoid, and maybe amber or yellow is a little bit less. But I don't feel that that's particularly functional. So one of my favorite questions is, what are you eating every day? So what is going into your body on an everyday basis, or an almost, damn it, everyday basis, that could be causing this issue? And so our standpoint is we work with what we call the gateway allergens to begin with, because there are a few things that they are in the diet, a standard diet, a lot. They're highly prevalent in a standard diet. And when we eliminate those sensitivities, then it's a bit like a house of cards, that a lot of things change. And the immune system can start to repair itself. And so if you're intolerant to, I don't know, passion fruit, you might not be intolerant to passion fruit once you have eliminated the gateway allergens. And again, it needs to be very, very functional. Then we can start to spot anomalies. So we have a little process, we call it the hierarchy of food intolerances, don't we? Where we eliminate the gateway intolerances. And then once those are eliminated, and after a few weeks, you can start to see, the immune system had a bit of a jiffle about and a bit of a calm down. Then it becomes clearer. Okay, we were still experiencing symptoms. Where do we go next? And then we have the next layer that we look at. And then again, a little bit of a jiffle. Let's see what happens. Then the next layer. And then after that, we're starting to look at really the random things. And it's interesting because, bananas might be considered a random thing. Passion fruit might be considered a random thing. But actually, very often, they're not random. So tomatoes for us would be one of those layers. That it doesn't seem random to a practitioner, but it might do to you just walking around with this random intolerance. But it is nearly always something you're exposed to on a regular daily basis. So that might be, formaldehyde because of where you work, or it might be, it's very unlikely to be random. And that's where we work differently.
The important thing with food intolerances is if you're eating inflammatory foods on a regular basis, then you're going to be irritating the gut. And what happens in the small intestine, which is our place for absorbing all of our nutrients, there's tight junctions in the small intestine. And when they're exposed to regular inflammatory foods that we can't digest, foods that we can't process, those tight junctions start to open and allowing food particles, proteins into the bloodstream, which is triggering the immune response. So when we cut out these inflammatory foods, usually how we work is we look at gut repair. And when you start to repair the gut, when you start to help the body to digest again, then you see a change with food intolerances.
Yes.
So I've had quite a few clients who come in and are really struggling to eat anything.
Yes.
And so we cut those inflammatory foods out, we do the gut repair work, and then we find that that they can reintroduce in foods, that digestion is much easier. Yes. And foods that are healthy are being processed.
And look, hey, you're absolutely right. It can massively change. And I know that, personally, my experience was one of the first things I got interested in this line of work was allergies and intolerances, because I had a list as long as my arm of things that I couldn't go near, including any cosmetics, couldn't put anything on my face. There was just, literally 30 foods I couldn't eat. But the one that I was eating on a regular basis was wheat, but I didn't seem to have a reaction to wheat. So that's why wheat is our number one go-to, not because of my journey, but because of the science behind why wheat is such a catalyst for an immune response. And I always say to people that basically if you're eating something you're intolerant to, and people go, oh, I'm just a bit intolerant. I go, yeah, okay. And we can all make choices around what we want to eat and when we want to eat them. But it's like you're drip feeding your body a bit of arsenic. So let's just take wheat, for example. If you're going to have a massive kind of baguette, well, that's a big chunk of arsenic. You're probably going to feel a bit rank afterwards. If you're going to steal someone's onion ring when you're out, much smaller amount of wheat, you might still have a response. Or if it's in a bit of gravy, you might still have a response, but it might be much lower level. So it's how much arsenic are you comfortable having in your diet before your body goes, no, just no. And we also don't want to be eating arsenic on an everyday basis if we're working towards full health, vitality and wellness.
So with our stages, we've got wheat as our first gateway allergen. And so if a client cuts wheat out and they're not seeing the improvement, then we go to stage 2, which is looking at all grains. Why do we cut out wheat first and then look at all grains?
Good question. I'm glad you asked it.
Well, thank you.
So gluten, this whole gluten thing, gluten itself isn't the devil. Gluten was a really big part of the human diet. Some people are better with it than others, and there's a lot of speculation around why. But gluten itself, a lot of nutrients, etc. Except in 1969, we hybrid the wheat grain, so it wasn't particularly crop resistant. It used to fall over quite a lot. Was very susceptible to wheat blight and things like that. And in 1969, a very clever man called Norman Borlaug hybrid the grain, and wheat used to be very, very tall, and now it's that uniform, kind of quite short, dwarf wheat it's called, and we get a greater crop yield. It's more resistant to blight, etc. And so it's become a very common commodity. The problem is that it was never tested to be fit for human consumption, and the gluten content has dramatically increased. So to give you an idea, the gluten content in things like rye, barley, spelt, which are all, of course, other glutens, oats, it's about 8%. It's very low. It's usually tolerable for humans, apart from if you've got very specific conditions. Wheat, astronomically higher. Huge increase in the amount of gluten. Now, gluten in Latin means glue. So now we're consuming this huge amount of gluten, which is literally sticking itself to the bowel, can't be digested. Those tight junctions, that inflammation is all happening. Those tight junctions are opening up, particles of gluten going into the bloodstream, and then it goes somewhere and sticks where it decides to stick. So that might be in the neural chain. That's when you're talking migraines. Eventually things like maybe Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia. We're talking about getting stuck in the joints. This is where we're looking at things like rheumatoid arthritis, any kind of really bad joint pains, arthritis itself. It can just get stuck anywhere. Once it's in your bloodstream, it can get stuck anywhere. So that in itself was awful. Then in the 1980s, we started spraying the wheat with a new form of pesticide. And that pesticide is glyphosate, which is basically like a Roundup, Monsanto Roundup, and it's an antibacterial. But it's a non-discriminatory antibacterial. So, it does stop the blights on the wheat, greater crop yield, except as soon as we're eating it, this antibacterial is obliterating all the good bacteria in our bodies. Now, the good bacteria in our bowel forms our immune system. So every single time we eat wheat, we are obliterating our immune system, hence why we call it arsenic, and a little bit why every single time we're eating it, we're having this response. Now, that hasn't happened to the other grains. We haven't mass farmed them like we have. It's basically a Franken grain. We've completely ruined modern wheat. It's completely unrecognizable to its ancestry. So we've ruined it, we broke it. Other grains we haven't done that to yet. So the difficulty is we start off with wheat because most people, most of the time, are wheat intolerant, even if they're not showing symptoms like I wasn't to eating wheat. Trust me that if you're getting any other symptoms, like some of the ones we've mentioned, there is a food intolerance going on there. And first and foremost, that's probably wheat because it's so prevalent in our diet. People can be eating it 5-6 times a day with your biscuit here and there, a bit of pasta. It's just in our diet constantly. When we remove wheat, then everything can start to change. However, some people have become so intolerant to wheat, we get something called gluten cross sensitivity, and that is where the body, as soon as we eat something like rye or spelt or oats even, the body goes, oh God, that's got gluten in it. I can't process that. I'm still in too much distress from all of the abuse that I've had from wheat. So it starts to see other grains as no's. Now, my experience is that unless somebody has something like full-on celiacs, which is the autoimmune condition that stops us being able to process any gluten at all, when people have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is a lower level gluten sensitivity, there's often a grain or two or three that they can eat. So if I look at me, I clearly had a very bad gluten intolerance, but I could tolerate a bit of barley. That was way back in the day, but I couldn't have anything like rye or spelt. Well, because I've now eliminated all of that for so long, I can get away with the odd bit of oats, the odd bit of spelt, the odd bit of rye without any symptoms whatsoever. So as we get to the point where we have got more antibodies back, our immune system's functioning better, we can cope with some of the other grains. And there are arguments for and against. I mean, the paleo diet says no to any of them. The plant paradox diet says no to any of them for a variety of reasons. But actually, I think to be able to live a life, an easy life, and be able to go out and about and eat foods, it's actually quite good to be able to eat a variety of things. So eating the odd bit of spelt, the odd bit of rice, or rice is fine, the odd bit of rice, sorry, the odd bit of oats. Actually, this is where we need to get the body to as a buffer.
I think what's fascinating is the new research that's coming through on the microbiome that is looking at the importance of diversity in diets.
Yeah.
So we've seen in our careers how a lot of foods have been stripped out and diets have become very bland. And now with this new research that's coming through on the microbiome, that we need to start getting this diversity. So us as practitioners and teachers, we are looking at, right, okay, we really need to look at the inflammatory foods, which is the wheat, the milk, the sugar. If someone can tolerate a grain, then great. I mean, you're increasing that diversity. So,
well, and
it can be a good form of fibre.
If someone can tolerate something, great.
Yeah.
So wheat, that's why wheat predominantly are rather than other grains. So if someone gives up wheat and they're still having, what they tend to find is they definitely feel an improvement, but then there might still be some symptoms hanging around. That's when we'd be testing other grains.
Yeah. And dairy's an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because on our food hierarchy, we cut out milk first, because milk, the way it is processed, it has a lot of the enzymes stripped out to allow it to be processed. It's high inflammatory, it can create a lot of mucus in the body. And dairy fat that you can get in butter and in cheese, particularly the dairy fat in butter, can be great again for the microbiome if someone can tolerate it. And so if you're ingesting grass-fed butter or cheese, aged cheese, then you are getting some nutrients such as like vitamin D or some calcium, some magnesium. So if someone can tolerate certain parts of dairy, then great. But milk, because of the way it's processed and because of its high inflammatory content, is something that we cut out. Yeah. It also has quite a knock-on effect. We see that wheat has an effect on the digestion, particularly. It's milk that we see with hormones.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Highly estrogenic. So people with endometriosis, polycystic ovaries really notice huge differences when they start cutting out cow's milk. And it's particularly cow's milk, not necessarily goat's milk. Some people can't process either very well at all, and that comes down to the different caseins and also, you know, the lactose. So it's
also with goats and cow's dairy. The cow's digestion is so different from human digestion. Goats is a little bit more similar to human digestion, so we can process it a little bit easier. It's also not, the goat's dairy tends to not be mass farmed like the cow's dairy.
And I go back to this thing like with wheat, it's about exposure. So to begin with, once the body is a bit overwhelmed with all the arsenics, all the different types of arsenic that we're having, once we eliminate those, the body has a chance to rest, recover, repair. Oh, now I might be able to eat a bit of rye. Oh, now I might be able to eat a bit of goat's milk or goat's cheese, these are signs that your body is actually doing its job again. It's able to buffer. It's not just going into a massive immune crisis, which is ultimately usually what we're seeing in clinic.
So our stage 1, our gateway allergens are wheat, milk and sugar. We haven't really talked about sugar. When we talk about sugar, we're talking about the processed sugar, the cakes, the sweets, the cereals, the heavily sugared cereals, rather than fruit sugars or sugar and fruit, or are we talking about fructose as well?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it depends on someone's symptoms and what's going on. But the issue that we have with fructose, again, we broke fruit. So, I remember buying apples as a child, and they were always a bit like that, apples were quite tart. And these days, the ones that are predominantly sold are things like the pink ladies, which are much sweeter. You go into someone like Tesco's and, go to buy soft fruits, and it's all the super sweet raspberries, super sweet. And even super sweets are super sweeted versions of the strawberries that we now get that you don't need to put sugar on. I remember as a kid, you'd always put sugar on strawberries because they were so tart. That's not the case anymore. The foods that are coming through are, again, hybrid for the sweeter versions. So we've again distorted the food chain. I mean, blackberries these days, you can just, delicious, just eat them. But that's not representative of how the fruit is in its natural state. It's been hybrid or GM'd, depends on what they've done to it. So there can be an issue with the very, very sweet things. So we tend to encourage people to go away from things like bananas, mangoes, all the sweet things, and stick to the berries and not the super sweet versions.
Yeah. So stage 1, wheat, milk, sugar. And then stage 2, if we're not seeing improvement, we look at grains and dairy, which we've talked about. Stage 3, we start to look at nightshades, which comes into your point about tomatoes.
Yes.
So what are the nightshades?
The nightshades are potatoes, of course, prevalent in particularly British diets. Tomatoes.
When you say potatoes, you're talking about white potatoes, not sweet potatoes?
White potatoes, yeah. They're from a different family, aren't they, sweet potatoes? So white potatoes, tomatoes, aubergine, and peppers. Peppers are such a huge allergen, and in so many foods. And people can respond differently to either of the colours, but yeah, they're the nightshades, and they're the deadly nightshade family. And some people, particularly people in an immune crisis, so I'll be talking about people with any kind of autoimmune condition, eczema, asthma, psoriasis, then we start getting on to some of the biggies like Crohn's, like rheumatoid arthritis, MS, like, all of the biggies. Eczema and asthma are just much more containable versions of them, things like Hashimoto's, etc., all the biggies. Definitely nightshades are going to be causing an immune response. So starting to strip those out of the diet it can be important. But again, we test.
Yeah, and how do we test?
We use muscle testing as our response mechanism. And again, so if you go, well, I've been to the doctor and I didn't show up, well, a blood test requires a 75% change in the physiological state of the blood to show up as a positive. So that's 75% change. Like with muscle testing, we are able to test much lower percentages. So there is a blind spot in the medical model with blood testing that we're able to pick up with kinesiology, with the muscle testing. And because it's immediate, it's an immediate response, which you don't get from hair testing.
So the other thing that we look at, as well as nightshades, is eggs.
Yes.
I know both you and I would love to have in our diets because eggs are amazing. They're considered a health food, right? I mean, vitamin A, vitamin D, the B vitamins, there's B12 in there, there's choline and zinc. I mean, they're just a protein. They're amazing little nubbins of joy, but they're so allergenic.
Yeah, they really are. Again, for people who have got these sensitive immune systems, which includes us. Delicate flowers.
One thing that we've got in our clinic is we've got the egg white and the egg yolk that we can test. And I definitely find that immune clients, people who've got autoimmune conditions, can sometimes digest the egg yolks, because it's the egg white that is designed to protect the egg that's got a lysozyme in it,
Yeah.
which is designed to protect the egg, but it is something that's really difficult to digest, and it can really irritate those tight junctions that we were talking about earlier.
Really? So yes, sometimes egg yolks are okay, but yeah, eggs can be really, really difficult for people. So again, this can be something that you're eating every day. And then lastly, nuts and seeds. So interestingly, all that whole panoply that we just talked about comes under the autoimmune protocol. Like if you Googled autoimmune protocol, you just eliminate all those foods. And we wouldn't go there straight away. Like we're saying, we do it in this process, because just taking away a load of foods doesn't give you the information that you need. You need to go bit by bit and start to see what changes in the immune system, and then, start to tweak and tailor. The other things we would then look at after we've looked at things like nuts and seeds is then the specific things like, well, celery is a big allergen. So everyone on celery juice, no. Big allergens, no. I feel great on it. Yeah, no, that's just an adrenaline hit. Give it 5 months and we're going to be an autoimmune flare-up. But then, it might be something specific like bananas. Like, okay, well, we've looked at all of this. We haven't got anywhere. What are you eating every day? And then we start to drill down.
Yeah, it's a really unique way of looking at food intolerances. And it does come from years and years of both of us going through our own food intolerances, but also years in clinic where we have been doing these testings through our kinesiology, that we have been able to identify, okay, right, if we go down this pathway, if we do this, then we can actually see some real change.
Yeah, and I find it much less limiting actually than something like autoimmune protocol, which is just remove all these things from your diet, as to actually now this is bespoke to you. And we call this biochemic individuality, that each person has an individual biochemical response. So one man's meat is another man's poison. We absolutely are following that, but just with this very structured lens of how we're looking at it. So it's definitely a journey.
Amazing. Great. I really enjoyed that.
That's food intolerances.
That's food intolerances.